In rural Alabama, a lonely, debt-ridden widowed farmer faces losing his land. When a storm strands a Hells Angels group seeking shelter, he hesitantly welcomes them, only to discover they're delivering Christmas gifts for hospitalized kids. Seeing their cargo ruined, he sacrifices his family's treasured tractor to save their mission, never expecting his kindness to gift him a new, unexpected family. Before we dive in, what time are you listening? Where are you from? Drop a comment below and tell me. Samuel Washington stood on the creaking wooden porch of his farmhouse, watching the December sun disappear behind bare oak trees that stretched their skeletal branches against the gray Alabama sky. The cold wind cut through his worn flannel shirt, carrying with it the scent of frost and dying leaves across his 200 acres of barren farmland. 3 months had passed since Martha's funeral, and the silence that had settled over the Washington farm felt heavier than the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Inside the house, the grandfather clock that Martha had inherited from her mother chimed 6 times, its deep resonant tone echoing through empty rooms that once buzzed with her gentle humming and the aroma of fresh cornbread. Samuel walked slowly back through the front door, his arthritic knees protesting with each step across the uneven floorboards that he and his father had laid 40 years ago. The house felt too big now, too quiet, filled with memories that seemed to whisper from every corner where Martha's presence still lingered like morning mist. He made his way to the kitchen table where a single cup of coffee sat growing cold next to a stack of unopened bills, their red final notice stamps glaring at him like angry eyes. The hospital bills from Martha's cancer treatment towered in a neat pile beside the property tax notices, $50,000 in medical debt that had drained their savings account down to $847, and another $8,000 owed to the county that threatened to take away the only home he'd ever known. Samuel's weathered hands, scarred from decades of farm work and marked with faded tattoos from his time as a Marine in Vietnam, trembled slightly as he reached for the framed photograph of Martha that sat in its place of honor between the salt and pepper shakers. "Morning, sweetheart," Samuel whispered to the picture, his voice cracking like autumn leaves underfoot. In the photograph, Martha's warm brown eyes sparkled with the same joy she'd carried through 43 years of marriage, her head tilted back in laughter at some long-forgotten joke. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this place running without you, baby. The Hendersons next door won't even look my way when I wave anymore, and old Mrs. Patterson crosses the street when she sees me coming to town." He paused, studying Martha's face as if searching for answers in her eternal smile. "Sometimes I wonder if they're all just waiting for this old black farmer to finally give up and disappear." The isolation had crept in slowly at first, like weeds growing through cracks in concrete. When Martha was alive, she had been his bridge to the community, organizing church bake sales, volunteering at the local elementary school, bringing homemade soup to sick neighbors regardless of the color of their skin. But without her gentle diplomacy and infectious warmth, Samuel found himself increasingly invisible to the predominantly white farming community that surrounded his property. Phone calls went unreturned, invitations to town meetings stopped coming, and the friendly waves from passing pickup trucks had gradually faded into uncomfortable silence. Samuel set Martha's photograph back in its place and walked outside to the old red barn where his most prized possession waited beneath a canvas tarp. With careful, reverent movements, he pulled away the covering to reveal a 1952 John Deere Model B tractor, its green paint still gleaming despite its 70-year age. His father, Samuel Washington Sr., had bought this tractor brand new with money saved from 3 years of working double shifts at the steel mill in Birmingham, determined to own something that no white man could ever take away from his family. "Daddy always said you were more than just a machine," Samuel murmured, running his calloused palm along the tractor's smooth fender. "Said you represented everything we'd fought for: independence, dignity, the right to work our own land and build something lasting." The tractor was worth at least $15,000 to collectors, enough money to pay off the property taxes and buy him a few more months of time. But selling it would be like selling his father's dreams, his family's legacy, everything that made him Samuel Washington instead of just another forgotten old man counting down his final days. As darkness settled over the farm like a heavy blanket, Samuel returned to the house and sat in Martha's rocking chair by the window, staring out at the empty fields that had once produced prize-winning cotton and corn. The house creaked and settled around him, filled with the ghosts of better times, Martha's laughter during Sunday dinners, the sound of children's voices from the neighbor kids who used to help with harvest season, the sense of belonging to something bigger than himself. Now there was only the ticking of the grandfather clock, the whistle of wind through gaps in the window frames, and the crushing weight of loneliness that pressed down on his chest like a stone. In the distance he could see the warm yellow lights glowing in the windows of the Henderson farm, where 3 generations of the same family gathered around their dinner table each evening. Samuel wondered what it would feel like to have children and grandchildren, to know that his name and his stories would continue long after his body returned to the Alabama soil. Instead he faced the terrifying prospect of dying alone and forgotten, his farm sold to pay debts, his father's tractor hauled away by strangers who would never understand its true value. The storm clouds that had been building all day finally opened up, sending fat raindrops against the windows with increasing intensity. Samuel closed his eyes and listened to the drumming of rain on the metal roof, remembering how Martha used to say that storms always brought change, sometimes destroying what came before, but sometimes clearing the way for something new and unexpected to take root. As he drifted toward sleep in the rocking chair, Samuel Washington had no idea that the biggest storm of his life was less than 24 hours away, and with it would come the most unlikely salvation he could ever imagine. The storm hit Millbrook County like a freight train at 11:47 p.m. on December 22, transforming the quiet Alabama countryside into a battlefield of howling wind and driving rain. Samuel Washington jolted awake in Martha's rocking chair as a massive gust of wind slammed against the farmhouse, rattling every window and sending something heavy crashing across the front porch. The electricity had died hours ago, leaving him in complete darkness except for the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated his property in stark, ghostly snapshots. He fumbled for the flashlight on the side table, its weak beam cutting through the blackness as he made his way to the kitchen window. Outside, the storm raged with a fury he hadn't witnessed in decades. 60-mile-per-hour winds bent the old oak trees nearly in half, while sheets of icy rain hammered against the barn and outbuildings like machine gun fire. The Weather Service had predicted a mild winter storm, but this monster seemed determined to tear apart everything Samuel's family had built over 3 generations. Then, cutting through the chaos of wind and rain, came a sound that made Samuel's blood run cold, the deep rumbling roar of motorcycle engines, dozens of them, growing louder by the second. He pressed his face against the rain-streaked glass, squinting into the darkness as headlights appeared on the county road like glowing eyes emerging from hell itself. The motorcycles moved in formation, their engines growling in defiance of the storm, heading straight toward his property. Samuel's hands began to shake as he watched 50 Harley-Davidson motorcycles turn into his gravel driveway, their headlights sweeping across his farmyard like searchlights. Even through the storm, he could make out the riders, all white men dressed in black leather jackets, their faces hidden beneath helmets and bandanas, moving with the practiced coordination of a military unit. The lead motorcycle pulled up near his front porch, and Samuel caught a glimpse of the patch on the rider's back, a skull with wings and the words Hell's Angels stitched in bold red letters. Every instinct Samuel had developed during 2 tours in Vietnam screamed at him to grab his shotgun and prepare for the worst. He'd heard the stories about motorcycle gangs, drug runners, weapons dealers, violent criminals who left destruction in their wake. And here they were, 50 strong, seeking shelter on the property of an isolated black farmer who had no neighbors close enough to hear his screams above the howling wind. The lead rider dismounted his bike and walked toward the house with long, confident strides, seemingly unbothered by the rain that plastered his gray hair against his skull. Samuel estimated him to be in his mid-40s, tall and lean with the weathered face of a man who'd spent his life on the road. What struck Samuel most was the absence of the wild, drug-crazed appearance he'd expected. This man moved with purpose and intelligence, his pale blue eyes sharp and calculating beneath heavy brows. A thunderous knock echoed through the house, followed by a deep voice that somehow carried over the storm. "Sir, we need shelter, we've got emergency cargo that can't get wet." Samuel stood frozen in his kitchen, flashlight trembling in his grip, torn between fear and the deeply ingrained Southern hospitality that Martha had always insisted defined their character. Through the window, he could see the other riders dismounting their motorcycles, working quickly to unload large wooden crates from custom-built trailers attached to several bikes. The boxes were covered with heavy canvas tarps and handled with extraordinary care, as if they contained something precious or dangerous. Another knock, more insistent this time. "Please sir, we're not here to cause trouble, we just need a dry place for a few hours." Samuel's mind raced through his options. His old barn could barely keep the rain off his tractor, and his house was too small for 50 men. But the storage warehouse his father had built in 1963 still had a solid roof and enough space to house the entire group. The practical voice in his head screamed warnings about inviting strangers into his property, especially strangers who looked like they'd stepped out of a nightmare. But Martha's voice whispered in his memory, "Samuel Washington, you don't turn away people in need, no matter what they look like or where they come from." He walked slowly to the front door, his hand hovering over the deadbolt lock for what felt like an eternity. Finally, with a deep breath that tasted of fear and resignation, he opened the door to face the storm and the stranger on his porch. The man stood with water streaming down his leather jacket, his hands raised peacefully in front of his chest. "I'm Jake Morrison," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "These are my brothers. We're traveling through to make a Christmas delivery, and we can't let our cargo get damaged. Will you help us?" Samuel studied Jake's face in the lightning flashes, searching for signs of deception or violence. What he saw instead was desperation mixed with genuine respect. This man was asking, not demanding, despite having 49 armed companions at his back. "I've got a warehouse out back," Samuel finally said, raising his voice above the wind. "It's dry and big enough for your group, but I want to know what's in those boxes." Jake's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "It's Christmas cargo, sir. Time-sensitive delivery. We can't open it to the elements, and we can't discuss the details. But I give you my word, we mean no harm to you or your property." Samuel felt his pulse quicken at the evasive answer. Christmas cargo that couldn't get wet, couldn't be discussed, and required an armed escort of 50 bikers. Every red flag in his mind was waving frantically, but the alternative was leaving these men to face the storm in the open, and that went against everything his parents had taught him about basic human decency. "Follow me," Samuel said, stepping into the rain with his flashlight held high. "But I'm trusting you, Mr. Morrison, don't make me regret it." As he led the Hells Angels convoy toward his father's old warehouse, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that he was either making the biggest mistake of his life, or walking into the most important night he'd ever lived through. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Washington farm on December 23rd, painting the storm-damaged landscape in muted shades of brown and silver. Samuel had barely slept 3 hours on his living room couch, his ears tuned to every sound coming from the warehouse where 50 Hells Angels had spent the night guarding their mysterious cargo like soldiers protecting state secrets. Through his kitchen window, he watched the bikers moving around the building in organized shifts, always keeping at least 10 men stationed near the wooden crates that remained covered under heavy canvas tarps. Samuel poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot he'd brewed before sunrise, his hands still trembling slightly from exhaustion and anxiety. The rational part of his mind kept telling him he'd made a terrible mistake. No legitimate business required this level of secrecy and security. As he sipped the bitter coffee, fragments of overheard conversations from the night before echoed in his memory. "Christmas deadline can't be missed, the kids are counting on us, and most troubling of all, if we don't deliver on time, everything falls apart." The kitchen door creaked open, and Jake Morrison stepped inside, his gray hair still damp from washing up at the outdoor spigot. Without the intimidating leather jacket, and in the morning light, he looked more like a weathered construction foreman than a dangerous criminal. But Samuel noticed the way Jake's pale blue eyes constantly scanned the room, cataloging exits and potential threats with practiced efficiency. "Mind if I sit down, Mr. Washington?" Jake asked, gesturing toward the empty chair across from Samuel at the scarred wooden table. "I wanted to thank you properly for your hospitality. Not many people would have opened their doors to us last night." Samuel nodded toward the chair while studying Jake's face for signs of deception. "Most people probably would have called the sheriff first and asked questions later," he said carefully. "Maybe they would have been smarter than me." Jake settled into the chair with a heavy sigh, his weathered hands folded on the table between them. "You did the right thing, sir. We're not what people expect when they see the patches and the bikes. Sometimes the worst-looking packages contain the most precious cargo." He paused, glancing toward the window where several of his men were visible moving around the warehouse. "I know you have questions about what we're carrying. All I can tell you is that there are children depending on us to make a delivery today, and if we fail them." His voice trailed off, leaving the sentence hanging in the air like smoke. Samuel felt his suspicions deepen at the vague answer. In his experience, honest men didn't need to speak in riddles about their business. He thought back to 1968, when he'd returned from Vietnam to find his hometown divided between those who welcomed him as a war hero and those who saw only his black skin. A group of white bikers had cornered him outside Henley's bar one night, calling him names that still burned in his memory 40 years later, threatening to teach the uppity colored boy his place. Only the intervention of Sheriff Mason had prevented a beating that could have left him hospitalized or worse. "You know, Mr. Morrison," Samuel said slowly, setting down his coffee cup with deliberate care, "I've had some experience with white men who travel in groups and keep secrets. Usually doesn't end well for folks who look like me." Jake's expression grew somber, and he leaned forward slightly. "I understand your concern, sir. I truly do. My grandfather fought in World War II, came home to find the country he'd bled for still wouldn't let him vote or eat in the same restaurants as white folks. He taught me that judging a man by his skin color or his circumstances is the quickest way to miss out on knowing someone extraordinary." Jake's voice carried a sincerity that made Samuel pause. "Sometimes life gives you a second chance to do better than the generation before you. This is one of those times for me." Before Samuel could respond, raised voices drifted in from the warehouse, not angry, but urgent and worried. Through the kitchen window, he could see several bikers gathered around one of the wooden crates, gesturing animatedly while Jake's lieutenant, a mountain of a man with arms covered in intricate tattoos, knelt beside the box with what looked like concern etched across his bearded face. "Trouble with your cargo?" Samuel asked, watching Jake's jaw tighten as he followed Samuel's gaze toward the commotion. "Storm damage," Jake replied tersely, standing up from the table. "We need to assess how bad it is and figure out our options." He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the doorknob. "Mr. Washington, I know I have no right to ask this, but would you consider keeping what you've seen here between us? There are people who depend on our discretion, and if word gets out about our operation..." Samuel felt his heart rate spike as the implications hit him. Operation. The word confirmed his worst fears. This wasn't legitimate business, it was something that required secrecy and possibly broke federal laws. He thought about Martha's photograph on the kitchen table, about the property taxes he couldn't pay, about the isolation that had consumed his life since her death. Was he so desperate for human contact that he'd allowed criminals to use his property as a base of operations? As Jake stepped outside, Samuel crept closer to the kitchen window and strained to hear the conversation taking place around the damaged crate. The canvas tarp had been pulled back partially, revealing the corner of a wooden box that had been split open by the storm. Through the gap, Samuel caught a glimpse of bright primary colors, red, blue, yellow, that seemed oddly cheerful and innocent compared to the serious expressions on the bikers' faces. "How many are ruined?" Jake's voice carried clearly across the yard. "At least half the contents of this crate, maybe more," came the reply from the bearded lieutenant. "The water got in through that crack and soaked everything on the bottom. We've got less than 8 hours to make the deadline and we're short on our delivery count." Samuel pressed his face closer to the glass, trying to make sense of what he was seeing and hearing. What kind of illegal cargo came in bright colors and needed to be delivered to children on a Christmas deadline? The pieces of the puzzle swirled in his mind, creating a picture that didn't quite fit any of his assumptions about drug dealers or weapons smugglers. As he watched Jake kneel beside the damaged crate and carefully examine its contents with the tenderness of a man handling something precious, Samuel Washington realized that nothing about this situation was what it appeared to be. The question was whether that made these mysterious visitors more dangerous or more desperate than he'd originally feared. The warehouse felt hollow and abandoned when Samuel Washington stepped inside at 4:30 p.m. on December 23rd, the afternoon sun slanting through dust-covered windows to illuminate the empty space where 50 Hells Angels had camped for 18 hours. They had departed 2 hours earlier in a thunderous roar of motorcycle engines, their damaged cargo loaded back onto trailers with the grim efficiency of soldiers retreating from a failed mission. Jake Morrison had shaken Samuel's hand with what looked like genuine gratitude, but there had been something broken in the man's pale blue eyes, a defeat that went deeper than storm damage or missed deadlines. Samuel moved slowly through the cavernous space, picking up scattered pieces of canvas tarp and coils of rope that the bikers had left behind in their hurried departure. The concrete floor still bore the tire marks from their motorcycles, and the air carried the lingering scent of leather and motor oil mixed with something else, something that reminded him of the children's section at the Walmart in Montgomery, though he couldn't quite place what it was. Near the back corner of the warehouse, where the damaged wooden crate had been stored, Samuel noticed a small piece of white paper that had apparently fallen from someone's pocket during the morning's frantic damage assessment. He bent down with a grunt, his arthritic knees protesting, and picked up what appeared to be a child's letter written in purple crayon on lined notebook paper. The careful, uneven handwriting of a young student filled both sides of the page, and as Samuel began to read, his understanding of everything that had transpired over the past day crumbled like sand in his weathered hands. "Dear Santa's helpers," the letter began, "my name is Jenny Martinez, and I am 8 years old. I am writing this from the Children's Hospital in Birmingham, where I have been staying since October, because I have something called leukemia, which makes me very sick, but the doctors say I might get better if I keep taking my medicine and being brave." Samuel's hands began to tremble as he continued reading, the innocent words hitting him like physical blows. "I know you are not really Santa, but the nurses told me you bring toys to kids in the hospital who can't go home for Christmas. I don't need anything fancy, just maybe a doll to keep me company during the long nights when I can't sleep because of the medicine. My mama cries sometimes when she thinks I'm not looking, and I want to be strong for her, but it gets scary being sick and away from home." The letter went on to describe Jenny's hospital roommate, a 6-year-old boy named Marcus, who loved toy cars, and her friend Sarah, who dreamed of having art supplies to draw pictures for her family. Each carefully formed sentence painted a picture of children facing the unimaginable with courage that humbled Samuel to his core. At the bottom of the second page, Jenny had drawn a wobbly picture of motorcycles with wings, surrounded by smiling stick figures labeled "Sick Kids" and "Angels Who Help." Samuel sank down onto an empty wooden crate, the letter clutched in his shaking hands as the full magnitude of his mistake crashed over him like a tidal wave. The Hells Angels hadn't been drug dealers or weapon smugglers, they had been volunteers with the Toys for Tots program, spending their own money and time to deliver Christmas gifts to hospitalized children who had nothing to look forward to except more treatments and uncertain futures. His cell phone rang with a sharp electronic chirp that echoed through the empty warehouse. Samuel fumbled for the device, seeing Jake Morrison's number on the caller ID screen. "Washington." Jake's voice came through the speaker, thick with exhaustion and something that sounded like barely controlled anguish. "I wanted to call and let you know that we made it to Birmingham, but we failed them, Samuel. The storm damage was worse than we thought. Half the toys are ruined, and we don't have enough time or money to replace them before the Christmas Eve deadline." Samuel could hear the sound of traffic in the background, and voices, other bikers talking in low, defeated tones about disappointing children who were already fighting battles no child should ever face. "We've been doing this run for 8 years, Jake continued, his voice cracking slightly. "Ever since my daughter Emma lost her fight with cancer at the age of 7, she spent her last Christmas in that same children's ward, and the only thing that brought light to her eyes in those final weeks were the volunteers who showed up with gifts and smiles." Jake paused, and Samuel could hear him struggling to maintain composure. "I promised myself I'd never let another child spend Christmas in a hospital bed without knowing that someone out there cared about them. But tonight, 23 kids are going to wake up on Christmas morning with nothing under the tree except their IV stands and medicine schedules." Samuel closed his eyes, seeing Jenny's crayon drawing of motorcycles with wings, thinking about Jake's daughter Emma, who would never see another Christmas, remembering Martha's voice telling him that storms sometimes cleared the way for something new and unexpected to take root. "Jake," Samuel said quietly, his voice steady despite the emotions churning in his chest, "how much would it cost to replace those damaged toys?" About $15,000, Jake replied with a bitter laugh. Might as well be $15 million for a bunch of bikers who pool their gas money just to make these runs. Samuel looked out through the warehouse windows at his father's 1952 John Deere tractor sitting in the barn, its green paint gleaming in the afternoon sun like a beacon of possibility. For 70 years that machine had represented his family's independence, their dignity, their refusal to be defeated by a world that too often judged them by the color of their skin rather than the content of their character. But maybe, Samuel thought, as he stared at Jenny's letter, true independence wasn't about holding on to the past. Maybe it was about having the courage to let go of everything you treasured in order to give someone else a future worth fighting for. Jake, Samuel said, his voice growing stronger with each word, I think I might be able to help with that. The December sun was setting behind the Alabama hills when Samuel Washington walked across his farmyard toward the old red barn, Jenny Martinez's letter still folded carefully in his shirt pocket next to his heart. Each step felt both heavy with loss and light with purpose as he approached the building where his father's 1952 John Deere tractor waited beneath its protective canvas cover. His cell phone buzzed with text messages from Jake Morrison, updates about the devastated children at Birmingham Children's Hospital, desperate attempts to find last-minute donors, the crushing reality that Christmas Eve was less than 18 hours away. Samuel pulled away the canvas tarp with trembling hands, revealing the emerald green paint that still gleamed like a jewel despite 7 decades of faithful service. He ran his weathered palm along the smooth metal fender where his father had taught him to drive when he was 8 years old, remembering the pride in Samuel Washington Sr.'s voice when he'd said, "Son, this tractor represents everything we fought for: dignity, independence, the right to build something lasting that no man can take away from us. I'm sorry, Daddy." Samuel whispered to the machine that had been his family's most precious possession. "I know what this tractor meant to you, what it meant to our family's legacy, but maybe the greatest legacy isn't what we keep menus, maybe it's what we're willing to give away when someone needs it more than we do." He walked slowly back to the farmhouse where Martha's photograph smiled at him from its place of honor on the kitchen table. Samuel picked up the framed picture with both hands, studying his wife's warm brown eyes that had always seen the good in people, even when others couldn't see past their own prejudices and fears. "Martha, sweetheart," he said softly, "I'm about to do something that might seem crazy to everyone else, but I think you'd understand. There are children in that hospital who are fighting battles that make our problems look small. They need someone to show them that the world hasn't forgotten about them, that there are still people who care enough to sacrifice something precious for strangers." He pressed the photograph against his chest. "You always said that love isn't really love until it costs you something. Well, this is going to cost me everything I have left, but maybe that's exactly what love is supposed to do." At 6:30 p.m. on Christmas Eve, Samuel's cell phone rang with the contact number for Patterson's Classic Tractor Sales in Montgomery. Within 30 minutes he had arranged for emergency pickup and immediate payment for his father's John Deere, $15,000 in cash, enough to replace every damaged toy and buy additional gifts for children whose names weren't even on the original list. By 8:45 p.m., Samuel was standing in the toy section of a 24-hour Walmart in Birmingham, surrounded by Hell's Angels who moved through the aisles with the precision of a military operation. Jake Morrison pushed a shopping cart filled with dolls, art supplies and stuffed animals while consulting a handwritten list of children's names and ages. Other bikers loaded their carts with remote control cars, board games and coloring books, their leather jackets and intimidating tattoos drawing stares from late-night shoppers who had no idea they were witnessing an act of pure compassion. "Samuel," Jake said, stopping beside a display of toy motorcycles with a smile spreading across his weathered face, "I don't know how we can ever repay you for this." "You don't repay kindness," Samuel replied, remembering something Martha used to say. "You pass it forward to the next person who needs it." At 11:30 p.m. on Christmas Eve, a convoy of 50 motorcycles roared through the streets of Birmingham toward Children's Hospital, their headlights cutting through the darkness like stars fallen to earth. Samuel rode behind Jake on a Harley-Davidson touring bike, his arms wrapped around the man he'd misjudged so completely just 40 hours earlier. In the trailers behind them, hundreds of carefully wrapped presents bounced gently against their restraining straps, each one representing hope for a child who had been fighting battles that adults twice their age couldn't imagine facing. The pediatric ward of Birmingham Children's Hospital transformed into something magical as 50 Hell's Angels filed through the corridors carrying bags of presents, their boots echoing softly on polished floors, while Christmas carols played from speakers mounted near the nurse's station. Samuel watched 8-year-old Jenny Martinez's face light up like the 4th of July when Jake handed her a beautiful baby doll with dark hair and brown eyes that looked just like her. In the bed next to her, 6-year-old Marcus squealed with delight at the remote-control NASCAR racer that Samuel had personally selected, while Sarah clutched an art set to her chest as if it contained all the colors she'd ever dreamed of painting. "Are you really angels?" Jenny asked Samuel as he knelt beside her hospital bed, her small hand reaching out to touch the Hell's Angels patch on Jake's leather jacket. "No, sweetheart," Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion. "We're just people who learned that Christmas magic happens when you care more about someone else's joy than your own comfort." The local news crew arrived at 1:15 a.m., drawn by reports of an unusual Christmas Eve charity event. As cameras rolled, Samuel Washington stood in the hospital lobby surrounded by Hell's Angels, explaining how a winter storm had brought together the most unlikely family he'd ever been part of. The story aired on Christmas morning, showing the 67-year-old black farmer who had sold his most precious possession to buy toys for sick children, working alongside a motorcycle club that had been quietly delivering Christmas miracles for 8 years. By New Year's Day, Samuel's phone was ringing constantly with calls from neighbors who had seen the news coverage, church groups wanting to volunteer with future toy drives, and community members who suddenly saw him not as the isolated old farmer they'd been avoiding, but as a local hero who had demonstrated what true Christmas spirit looked like. 6 months later, Samuel Washington had become Grandpa Sam to every member of Jake Morrison's Hell's Angels chapter, riding his own Harley-Davidson to charity events across 3 states. His farmhouse, no longer silent and empty, buzzed with activity as it became the unofficial headquarters for their Toys for Tots program. The property taxes had been paid by anonymous donations from the motorcycle community, and Samuel's days were filled with purpose he hadn't felt since Martha's death. On a warm June evening, as Samuel sat on his front porch watching Jake's granddaughter play in the yard where cotton had once grown, he thought about the winter storm that had changed everything. Martha's photograph still held its place of honor on the kitchen table, but now it was surrounded by pictures of hospital visits, charity rides, and the extended family of leather-clad angels who had shown him that love transcends every boundary society tries to build. "You know, Martha," Samuel said quietly to the fading daylight, "I used to think family was about blood and color and all the things that make people the same, but I learned something important. Family isn't about who looks like you or talks like you. Family is about who shows up when you need them most, who stands with you when the storm hits, and who helps you find your way back to hope when you've lost everything else." As the Hell's Angels motorcycles rumbled into his driveway for their weekly planning meeting, Samuel Washington smiled and stood up to welcome home the family he never knew he was looking for, one that had arrived disguised as his worst nightmare and revealed itself to be his greatest blessing. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.